Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Andy knows I hold him in very high esteem, but I must say it is a great honor to be here with His Eminence, the Archbishop Demetrius, and also with Rabbi Schneider, who, with his appeal to conscience, has also done such an important public benefit for humanity, and especially to be with all of you, to be with the Archons that are with us here, because what you're doing is focusing the world's attention on a problem that goes to the heart of who we are in Western civilization, goes to a threat that is not being answered. The United States must lead on this planet today. The architects of this republic, who founded this republic, if we go down to the other end of Constitution Avenue there, we see the U.S. Capitol, and we know the importance that they put to this understanding, deep understanding of Western civilization, of the role of Christianity, of the role of Athens, of the role of Jerusalem, of the role and place of Byzantium. These were things they understood. You can read Thomas Jefferson, or you can read George Mason, you can read any of the architects of this system that we developed here, this concept of freedom, and understand what they tried to represent to the world. And you have to ask yourself, if this is the last best hope of mankind, are we ready to lead in directing the world to putting a stop to what is a genocide today in the Middle East against Christians, and what is across the world in many, many countries, a slow process of ethnic cleansing, or whatever we want to call the reality of the eradication of Christianity. And so that is why I think it is so important to consider, to really contemplate the words of the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew when he says to us, and I quote him, "What we are witnessing is the uprooting not only of a religious minority, but of an entire civilization. It must be characterized as nothing less than a genocide." And I think we have a special responsibility when in the Middle East, as Christians are being assaulted, expelled from their homes, detained, tortured, raped, murdered for their faith. We have that responsibility to lead the world to put a stop to this. The violence is beginning to mirror what we saw in terms of persecution that first appeared on the world stage when we think back to the Colosseum of Rome, when we think back to the persecution of early Christians. As Pope Francis recently said, when we read the history of the first centuries, we read of so much cruelty toward Christians. I tell you, there is the same cruelty today, and to a greater extent. So we now have witnessed the cruelty at the hands of ISIS, who over the past few years have conducted a targeted campaign of genocide, but we also have witnessed the cruelty of those who have the same attitude about Christians as ISIS, the same indifference to the plight of the minority Christian populations in their countries. We've witnessed terrorists who have coerced children to carry out their atrocities for them in a twisted attempt to corrupt future generations with their warped ideology. I have visited the Christian community in northern Iraq. I've met with Christians across the Middle East, and I've had some of them testify before my committee, Christians and Yazidis, about their plight, about the dire situation in Iraq and Syria. Sister Momaka of Mosul, Iraq, testified that ISIS's brutality was cultural and human genocide, and observed that the only Christians that remain in the plain of Nevada are those who were held as hostages. I am cautiously hopeful that this situation is turning around towards the better as Christians begin to return to Nineveh province, but I know that the government in Baghdad is not showing them the attention that would be warranted if the desire was really to have them protected. In the face of such atrocity, we have this responsibility to speak out, to act, and to tell what we know to our fellow Americans and to the world. I've worked with my colleagues in Congress, on both sides of the aisle, obviously, to do that. Last March, I authored and pushed unanimous passage of House Concurrent Resolution 75 that declared the actions of ISIS against Christians and Yazidis to be genocide, and urging the U.S. administration to call it what it is, to call it genocide. The government did just that, but it only did it after we moved the legislation out of committee and toward the floor. That's why we all have the responsibility to do what we can do, and I thank you for coming to us to get us to act. I visited Christian churches, as I shared with you, and congregations in northern Iraq, working to ensure humanitarian access and aid to those in greatest need. And I've worked across Central Asia as well to try to help with the diaspora of Christians who have fled the area in order to try to get them support, whether it's in Armenia or in other countries. But last month, we worked with Congressman Glenn Grothman to pass unanimously through committee House Resolution 407 that addressed this disturbing trend of increasing persecution against Christians around the globe, and called on the United States to promote religious freedom for Christians and to press all nations around the world to stop persecution of Christians at all national, local, and community levels. Now, I will share with you that in no time in history has a country been as powerful as the United States, and that with all our diplomatic leverage around this globe, with all the pressures that we can bring to bear, if we cannot reverse that trend, then we are not trying. Part of many genocidal campaigns the second part of genocidal campaigns that you're well aware of is the deprived sense that they are going to purge a community of its cultural and religious sites. They're going to purge that from the land. At the hands of ISIS, of course, century-old churches have been burned, bombed, demolished. Religious artifacts have been looted, sold on the black market. Sacred objects have been destroyed. I worked with a ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Eliot Engel, that many of you know as well, to author House Resolution 1493, the Protect and Preserve Cultural Property Act, that prevents the sale or importation of the United States of religious articles from the Middle East. that were removed after the beginning of the Civil War there. And this bill was signed last year. Last week, we marked the feast day of Apostle St. Andrew, who in the 1st century AD courageously and freely shared his religious beliefs, leading thousands in the faith and establishing the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Byzantium, in Istanbul, modern-day Turkey. It is a tragedy that today's inheritors of his great legacy are so thoroughly constrained in the practice of their beliefs. The Turkish government has placed so many regulations that prevent the free election of their religious leader. Orthodox churches and properties have been confiscated, have been vandalized, left to ruin, or converted into mosques, converted into museums, in one case converted into a casino. Religious icons have been destroyed, or they've been sold on the black market. The lack of official legal status has meant that the church cannot raise and manage funds to maintain its properties and operations. And its priests who cannot obtain legal residency must rely on tourist visas, which must be frequently renewed in order to serve the church in Turkey. For years, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has also been unable to even train its own clergy in Turkey, as the only Orthodox seminary in the country, located in Halki, has remained closed now for over 40 years. These oppressive tactics impede the religious freedom of Orthodox believers within Turkey, as well as 300 million Orthodox believers around the world. There must be a change. It must be now, and the United States must provide the leverage to force that change. Now, I have met with the Ecumenical Patriarch, and there is no one more willing to engage with Turkish leaders in the community to promote peace, to promote tolerance, to promote interfaith dialogue. Yet he needs our help. At every opportunity, I have pressed Turkish leaders to lift these onerous restrictions and restore religious liberty to Orthodox believers. I've passed legislation through my committee to protect religious sites within Turkey and call for the return of all confiscated properties to their rightful owners, to the church. In October, Ranking Member Engel and I wrote to Secretary Tillerson, asking him to use all his diplomatic leverage to press Turkish leaders to abandon plans to convert the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul into an operational mosque. With these and other actions, I hope we can push Turkish leaders so that we force enactment of real reforms, so that we restore religious liberty to the Orthodox faithful there. And we must do the same elsewhere around the world. As St. Andrew said, love is acceptance. Let that be the guiding principle for us as we redouble our efforts to end religious persecution in all its overt and its subtle forms. And as we honor the legacy of those first church leaders by promoting freedom of religion for all oppressed people around the world. After all, this is the First Amendment of our Constitution. It is what brought most of us here, this desire to be part of a country built on an ideal where that first principle is freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So thank you very much for what you're all doing in this regard. Thank you.